They are hiding a dark secret. But who? That is what Mr Ballen said in his video this week. Someone is hiding a very dark secret, and I want to know who the hell it is. Knowing Mr Ballen, it's going to be someone who died. Or someone who's made someone die. Or, you know, if you're a Mr Ballen veteran by now, you know how his stories go, and they don't normally end well. If you end up in a Mr Ballen story, chances are you're not going to be the person who hears that story, if you get me drift. Anyway, if this is the first time being here, not seen any of my reactions, then please hit like and subscribe. It supports me, it supports the channel, and I do appreciate it very, very much. Right, Mr Ballen, let's go. Let's see who is hiding a dark secret.
Today's 3 stories show that no matter how harmless and trustworthy a person might look, you have no idea who they really are beneath the surface until it's too late.
Facts.
But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious
delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week.
So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice homemade cherry pie. But don't tell them you didn't remove the pits. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
That's ruthless.
Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Do you know what? There's nothing worse than a pip getting stuck in between your teeth and you can't get it out. It feels like it's this big in your mouth, doesn't it? That's ruthless for Mr Ballen, you know, with the like button. The right tutor, let's go.
On the evening of May 25th, 2023, a student named Jung Yoo-jung sat at her desk in her bedroom inside the house where she lived with her grandfather in Busan, which is the 2nd largest city in South Korea.
Right.
Jung was hunched over with her head in a book, studying for a really important test that she had coming up. But like the words on the page just kind of jumbled together and she couldn't focus, and you know, Jung just felt really frustrated because she knew like she needed to consume this material and internalize it, but the way she was doing it clearly wasn't working.
Right.
She really needed help. However, Jung had previously tried to find a tutor, like to get help, but finding the right tutor had proven to be very challenging. So Jung had recently signed up for this mobile app that was supposed to connect high school students to tutors.
So that's where you've gone wrong. First rule in a scary movie. We're sounding like Scream now. Don't go on mobile apps. Don't go meeting people on mobile apps. Don't do anything with mobile apps asking advice or whatever. Because ultimately, you end up on a Mr Ballen story, which means you are now not here anymore.
She had reached out to over 50 people, asking them if they could help her prepare for this really major exam in her 9th grade English class.
Stalkers.
But everyone she had spoken to either was not available or just wasn't a good fit. But on this night, as Jung stared down at her book, desperately trying to parse through the words on the page, she suddenly heard her phone buzz. And so Jung, who was sort of eager for a distraction here, she grabbed her phone and she saw there was a notification from that mobile app, the tutoring app. Okay. So Jung, she opened up the app and she read the message and she broke into a smile because the reply was from a potential tutor that she'd contacted earlier that day that she had been, you know, sort of optimistic about.
Okay.
According to this tutor's profile, her name was Chae-eun. She was a 26-year-old college student and she spoke fluent English. And now, in her reply, Chae-eun told Jung that she would be more than happy to help her and was actually available to start as soon as the day after tomorrow. Right. There was just one downside. Chae-eun tutored exclusively out of her own apartment, which was on the far north side of the city. So it would be pretty inconvenient.
Red flag number 2. Don't go to somebody's apartment if you don't know them. I'm picking up the story here now. Ted Bundy took people back to his apartments and they got killed. Bit of an extremity. That guy was twisted.
Out of her own apartment, which was on the far north side of the city. So it would be pretty inconvenient for Jung to just get there. And then also she knew her grandfather would definitely worry about her traveling that far alone.
Why don't you stop over at my house? That's coming. That's coming.
But after having searched for a tutor for so long with no success, Jung just did not want to pass up this opportunity. So she immediately messaged back that she couldn't wait to get started. And then she and Chae-eun set up their first meeting. 2 days later, on the evening of May 27th, Jung walked up to the tutor's apartment complex. It had taken her almost an hour to get here on the bus. And she'd been lugging, this huge bag with her full of her study materials the whole time. She
Right.
had brought along basically all of her stuff, just in case they actually got to studying today, which,
It's 2023. Surely all your stuff's on the computer. Come on. It's 2023.
realistically, Jung didn't know if they would. This is like their first meeting. She didn't really know what to expect. But either way, Jung was glad to be here. I mean, this represented progress. So Jung, along with her big old bag, went up to the door with the apartment number that Chaeyeon had given her, and she knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and Jung saw Chaeyeon standing there with a big smile on her face. And she looked exactly like she did in her profile picture on the app.
Well, at least that's
Chaeyeon
something.
then introduced herself and shook Jung's hand and welcomed her inside. Jung walked in and had a quick look around, and she saw the apartment was pretty small. It was a studio apartment. There was a bed and a couch in the same main area, and there was a kitchen and bathroom sort of branching off from there. Just
Right.
then, Jung heard Chaeyeon shut the door, and then she walked right past Jung and she took a seat on the couch, and then she sort of beckoned Jung to come have a seat next to her and come chat. And so Jung, she smiled, and she's got her bag, and she walks over and she sits down next to Chaeyeon, and the pair just start chatting. And, Chaeyeon asks her to explain again, sort of like, what are your main goals here? What can I help you with? And Jung said, well, I have this big test coming up for my English class, and, I was hoping you could help me with that. And Chaeyeon said, yeah, of course I can. I'm fluent in English. I've worked with many people on, similar testing material. So, this is going to be great. And so Jung, she's thrilled, and she says to her tutor, well, like, hey, I brought my stuff. Can we just like start the lesson right now? And Chaeyeon was sort of maybe taken a little bit aback. This is their first interaction, but she's like, okay, yeah, let me just get a drink of water first.
Yeah, and a knife.
So Chaeyeon,
Or a drug.
and she wanders off into the kitchen and disappears to get her water. And Jung unzips her bag and begins fishing out her studying materials. A few hours later, a taxi driver was driving through the northern part of Busan, scanning the sidewalk for potential customers. And at some point, as he looked around, he eventually saw this woman, who appeared to be maybe in her 20s, standing outside of an apartment complex, Chaeyeon's apartment complex. And this woman, she had this large, very heavy-looking black suitcase by her side.
Right.
And she was waving to the cab driver, clearly trying to hail him down. So the driver pulled up alongside the curb, he rolled down his window, and he called out to her and asked where she needed to go. And the woman told him that she needed to go to the Nakdong River. And this immediately struck the driver as being a little weird, because the Nakdong River was in a very isolated area far outside the city. It was
Right.
like a really odd place for a young woman to go alone, especially this late at night. But the driver also knew that he could charge the woman a pretty high fare for taking her all that way.
Cash is king.
So he said, okay. Then he popped
Listen,
the trunk of his
us as taxi drivers, I'm not a taxi driver, I'm just saying that like as part of their camaraderie. It's like, I don't care where you're going. Are you paying me? Yeah. Just give me the money. I don't give a shit. Do you know what I mean? Ruthless. Let's go.
cab and asked if she needed help with her suitcase. But she immediately said no, she had it. So the driver just shrugged, and he waited while this woman lugged this heavy suitcase to the back of his cab, and she hoisted it into the trunk. She shut the trunk, and then she climbed inside. And then the driver pulled away from the curb and started heading out of the city. And it was a long, quiet ride, but eventually he pulled up to the entry point for Nakdong River, which was basically a trailhead surrounded by bushes that led into this sort of semi-forested area. At this point, the driver parked, and the woman asked him how much she owed him, and he told her, and so she pulled out her money and she quickly paid him. And then, just out of habit, the driver asked the woman again if she needed help getting her suitcase out of the cab. But again, the woman very quickly said no, she didn't. She would handle it on her own, but thank you. So again, the driver just shrugged and popped the trunk. And then he waited as this woman got out and pulled the suitcase out of the back. Now, at this point, the driver knew, like, his job is done here. It's not his business what she's doing here.
Facts.
But, it's almost midnight, and he couldn't help but feel sort of concerned about dropping this woman off here, basically in the middle of nowhere so late at night. And he just wanted to make sure that she was okay. So instead of just driving away, he just continued to watch as she walked towards the trailhead. And as he watched her, he noticed that she was really struggling to move her suitcase. I mean, it looked like it was so heavy that she could barely drag it through the dirt. And it was at this point that the driver couldn't help but feel like something's off here. Like, this is not typical behavior. Everything about this just feels weird. Like, what's going on? So, because he had this sort of gut feeling that something was off with this lady, instead of just leaving altogether and continuing his night, he just drove a little ways away from where he dropped her off and then stopped. And he turned and he just watched the trailhead to see if the woman would come back out or if anybody else would show up.
Okay.
And so he just continued to watch and nothing happened for a while. But after about 20 minutes, he saw some movement and out of the woods comes this woman. And she still has this suitcase, but now it's plainly obvious that the suitcase is empty or whatever was really heavy inside of the suitcase.
She's dumped
has been
her body.
removed because she's moving the suitcase no problem, whereas before she could barely get it through the dirt.
Real photo. Oh no, there can't be a body in that, can there? That's too small to put a body in unless it's a child. But it's no.
In the driver, he couldn't help but think, like, what was in that suitcase? Because clearly she has come here to dump it somewhere out in this very isolated part of this area. Like, this just feels really bad. I don't even want to know what she's doing. Somebody needs to investigate this, though. This just feels wrong. And so he turned around, he started driving away, he pulled out his phone, and he called the police.
Yeah.
A few minutes later, the woman with the suitcase stood at the trailhead, hoping that another taxi might pass by soon and she could hitch a ride home. And at some point, she saw headlights approaching in the darkness, and for a second, she felt really hopeful, and she waved her hand like, hey, I need a ride.
It's the coppers.
But when the vehicle finally pulled up, she saw that it was not a taxi, it was a police cruiser. And this cruiser came to a stop right next to her, and then an officer stepped out of the car and asked her what she was doing out here so late. And in a very calm voice, the young woman just said she had come out here to drop off some trash because the dumpster at her apartment complex was full. But the officer didn't really seem to be listening to her.
In the middle of a creepy wood just outside of town, surely there's like a bin round the corner. Someone else's bin on the corner. That's a bit of a weak excuse.
But the officer didn't really seem to be listening to her. He was actually just staring at her big black suitcase. And he actually just asked her, "Can I see what's inside of that?" And this made the woman very nervous. But she also knew that the best thing she could do right now was just continue to stay calm and cooperate. So she nodded and said, "Sure, have a look." And so the officer walked up and he unzipped the suitcase and he flipped it open and he shined his flashlight inside. And it was empty, but it was covered in blood. Like the blood had soaked into the lining all across the inside of the suitcase. But the woman knew this was going to happen. I mean, she knew what was in there, and she'd prepared for this. She told the officer that she was simply on her period, and the blood he was seeing was nothing more than menstrual blood. But the look on the officer's face made it very clear that he did not believe anything she was saying. And at that moment, the woman's world came crashing down, because she knew that despite all the months of studying she had done, she had just failed her test. It would turn out that Jung Yu Jung was not a 9th grade student studying for an English exam. She was actually a 23-year-old woman masquerading as a high schooler. And her very important test was one she had actually created for herself. She wanted to see if she could commit the perfect murder. She had spent months obsessively studying true crime books and
What? I thought the woman at the house would have killed the student. But the student was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Hey, that was a twist.
Murder. She had spent months obsessively studying true crime books and documentaries, coming up with what she thought was a foolproof murder plan. And so after coming up with this plan, she posed as a 9th grader and hired a private tutor, Chae-eun. But when she went to Chae-eun's apartment, she wasn't carrying books in a backpack. She was carrying a knife inside of a suitcase.
Shit.
After Jung told Chae-eun that she wanted to start her lesson, Chae-eun got up, she went into the kitchen, she got some water, and when she came back, Jung had gotten out her knife, and she proceeded to stab Chae-eun to death.
Wow.
And then after that, she dismembered Chae-eun's body, put the pieces inside of that suitcase, and then Jung attempted to dispose of the body in the woods by the Nakdong River. But her foolproof plan did not work, because she was ultimately arrested before she even made it home that night. Jung Yu Jung was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
On what world would you think that getting a taxi with a body in a suitcase to a remote place at midnight would be the perfect murder and the perfect way to dispose of the body. In what way what true crime books has she been reading? How to Get Caught? Whew, honestly. What an absolute weirdo.
Everyday life is full of moments that you plan.
A stranger at the door. I hope it's not Juice and Jew. Story number 2. Let's go.
On the evening of January 31st, 2012, a 72-year-old retired high school teacher named Norm Johnson was playing the piano in his home in the tiny town of Madison, South Dakota, when his doorbell rang. And Norm was surprised. I mean, not because, just somebody had shown up at his house. I mean, the reality is getting unannounced visitors was not totally unusual in his household.
Right.
But tonight in particular, it was odd because the Madison High School basketball team had a big game that night, and pretty much the whole town was there cheering them on.
Right.
Who isn't at the game ringing my doorbell right now? Who would that be? Now, usually Norm would be at the basketball game too. Not only had he coached several sports at the high school during the years he had taught there, but also he had grown up in Madison and he had gone to the high school and he had played on the football team and been on the track team. And, those had really been, in some ways, some of the best years of his life. And I mean, even now as an adult, he still had such strong feelings and such a strong affinity for Madison High. It was like a home away from home. But despite all that, Norm had chosen not to go to the game tonight because he had just had a long day of meetings for the local boards that he volunteered on, and just in general, he felt like he just needed some time home to relax. And so before he got up, Norm called out to his wife, Barb, who was in their kitchen, and he just asked, hey, do you have any idea?
Hey, Barb, it's all kicking off again. Have you ever seen the royal family in this country? As soon as he said Barb, I'm like, I just thought of the royal family.
Yeah, who's at the door right now? She yelled back, no, I have no idea. So Norm got up from the piano and went to the door to answer it. When he opened the door, he saw a very unassuming man with gray hair and a beard who was standing out on the doorstep. Norm didn't know who this guy was, which was also just kind of odd, because again, Madison is like a really small town.
Right.
Pretty much everybody knew each other. But before Norm could ask him who he was or what he wanted, this guy asked Norm, "Are you Norm Johnson?" And Norm said, "Yeah." And then, without another word, the man raised a pistol he was holding and he fired. An hour later, Madison Police Sergeant Justin Meyer parked his car outside of a little brown house that was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Meyer had been totally shocked when the dispatcher had called him to tell him what had happened here, both because there hadn't been a murder in Madison in almost 100 years.
Wow.
And because Sergeant Meyer knew the victim, Norm Johnson. And
that's like Terminator stuff there, isn't it? Sarah Connor. Stranger at the door. I mean, why? Who wants to kill a 72-year-old retired teacher?
Now, Meyer walked up to the house and stepped over a huge puddle of blood right inside the front door. And then he found Norm's wife, Barb, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I mean, she looked like she was clearly in shock. Around Barb on the walls were all these old photos of her and Norm. And some of these photos clearly dated back to the 1950s when they had been high school sweethearts. Norm had been the star running back on the football team, and Barb had been a cheerleader. Meyer took a deep breath, and then he walked over and sat down next to Barb, and he asked her what happened. And she just said she didn't know. She didn't understand. She said that Norm had just gone to answer the door, and then seconds later, she heard what sounded like 2 gunshots. And then, as Barb sort of choked back tears, she said that she had run over and she had found Norm lying on the floor with blood pouring out of his face.
Wow.
And through the doorway, she happened to see this gray-haired man that she didn't recognize.
Gray-haired man?
Calmly just walking away down their walkway towards his car, and then he just drove off. And Sergeant Meyer...
That's got to be traumatizing to see that. Your partner of how many years? And then all he's done is gone to answer the door, and the next thing you see him on floor in a pool of blood. And it's like squirting out of his face. That's rough, that one.
When he heard this, I mean, he really couldn't believe it.
That is rough.
I mean, In many ways, he was just as baffled as Barb was about how in the world something like that could have happened, especially in this town. Like, what Barb was describing sounded like a premeditated hit, like an assassination. But Meyer just couldn't imagine who would want to do that to Norm. Like, Norm was beloved by the whole community, and he had been for decades. And so eventually, Meyer left the house and began to speak to all the neighbors. But, as he discovered, pretty much none of them were home at the time of the shooting because they were all out at that basketball game.
So he's picked his time, hasn't he?
And then also Meyer discovered that nobody in the area had security cameras outside their houses. And so nobody had captured any images or video of the crime. Because after all, I mean, Madison was typically a very safe area. And so by the time Meyer went home for the night, he was already starting to worry that he might not be able to solve this. However, the very next morning, Meyer got a call from a tipster. And this tipster said that there actually was one person in the area who definitely had a problem with Norm.
Okay.
That was a 73-year-old man named Carl Erickson. And at first, when Meyer began asking some basic follow-up questions, he just couldn't understand how this Carl guy could even be a suspect. I mean, he lived over an hour away in a different town. He was like a retired insurance officer with no criminal record. Like, how in the world would he be the guy that's, assassinating Norm?
Living an hour away means it'd be easier for him to get away with it and less suspicious, wouldn't it, if he lives an hour away?
Didn't make any sense. There was no clear connection. And then also there was just the fact that as people, they couldn't have been more different. Like, they definitely would not have overlapped in society. You have Norm, who's like very outgoing and social and beloved, and you have Carl, who's totally a loner, keeps to himself, and for the most part was kind of rude and just people didn't really like him. So like, there's just no reason that these two would come together. But Meyer had very little to go on here, and so he needed to follow up on any lead he really got. So that evening, he brought Carl in for questioning. And very quickly he realized that actually, Norm and Carl do have one thing in common. It would turn out Carl and Norm had gone to the same high school. Carl had grown up in Madison before he moved away. And the past 50 years of both of their lives had largely been defined by who they were as teenagers in high school. But while high school...
So you're telling me this is a high school grudge when they're in the 70s? Seriously?
By who they were as teenagers in high school. But while high school had been Norm's glory days, Carl had a very different experience. He had been an outcast who basically, at best, nobody really paid attention to. And so while Norm is like the star of the football team dating the cheerleader,
jealousy,
Carl had actually served as the football team's student manager, who basically ran errands for the coach and assisted from the sidelines. Deep down, Carl was deeply jealous of Norm specifically. I mean, he was popular, he's this jock, he's got all the things that he wanted but really couldn't achieve. And then one fateful day in the locker room after a practice, someone had come up behind Carl and put a jockstrap on his head as a kind of awful prank. And, Carl was not totally sure who did it, but over time, he became convinced it was Norm.
Right.
Now, over time, the people who were involved in that prank, the football players, they just kind of forgot about it. And in fact, many of them sort of forgot about Carl himself. But
it's a prank. Of course they're going to forget about it. But how can... Oh, my God. How can you hang on to a grudge? I mean, it's not even what if it was the guy who he's killed, who's put the jockstrap on his head. It's a fucking jockstrap on your head. He's not beat you up. He's not threatened you or anything. Oh, my God.
Carl never forgot the humiliation. He stewed about it for more than 50 years before his anger finally boiled over and he decided it was time to get
I'm going to go and kill him?
So, on January 31st, 2012, he drove to Norm's home and he shot him in the face. A few months later, Carl pled guilty to second-degree murder and he was sentenced to life in prison.
That's just bizarre. It's trivial, though. How can something so trivial be triggering you like 50 years later? I don't get it. I mean, humiliation's humiliation, I get that. Sort it at the time, but it's not killing like sort of thing, but sort it at the time. And it was only suspicion because he didn't know who actually put the jockstrap on his head. The third victim.
On the afternoon of August 10th, 2011, Detective Inspector John Finch of the London Metropolitan Police walked through the courtyard of the Radisson Edwardian Hotel in London. This was a massive luxury hotel with more than 400 rooms. Finch navigated past the beautiful greenery and the koi ponds and the multiple restaurants until he found the door he was looking for, which was roped off by crime scene tape with a uniformed officer standing in front of it. Through the doorway, Finch could see there were forensic technicians taking photographs and putting down evidence markers. This was a section of the hotel where members of the staff lived in small apartments.
Right.
And the police had been called here by hotel management because the bodies of 2 workers had been discovered inside, and a 3rd worker was missing. Finch had already been briefed on the basics. The 2 dead were a woman named Alice Adams, who was 20, and a man named Tibor Vass, who was also age 20. And they both had been at the same party in the apartment they were found in the night before.
Right.
Tibor actually lived in this apartment, and it was actually his roommate, a 31-year-old man named Attila Band, who was the missing 3rd worker. And this was basically all the police knew at this point.
Is he missing because he's done it and done a runner? I've got my suspicions already.
They didn't even have a theory yet on whether the missing Attila was another victim or the killer. They really just didn't know. And so now Finch greeted the officer who was at the door and introduced himself and showed his credentials, and then he ducked under the crime scene tape. And before long, he found himself standing in this small living room type area where the first victim, Alice, was lying in this massive pool of blood on the carpet. She was wearing a shirt, but no pants, but she did have underwear on, and she had a couch cushion that was placed over her face, and there were stab wounds all over her body. One of the forensics techs warned Finch to be careful where he stepped because there was so much blood all over the floor, you know, they didn't want Finch to step in it. So very carefully, Finch moved around the outside of the room and made his way into the kitchenette, where another forensics tech was picking up items one by one and dusting them for fingerprints and then setting them back down exactly where they were. And among sort of all the items scattered about the kitchenette, Finch noticed there were lots of pill and alcohol bottles.
Right.
So now he began to formulate his first theory, that this party they had all been to the night before had gotten way out of hand, and Alice had been attacked in a sudden rage by somebody who very likely knew her. Her missing pants suggested a possible sexual element, and the sheer number of stab wounds on her body and the amount of blood spatter really did suggest the killer was in some sort of a frenzy. The cushion that was found over Alice's face suggested that after the killer had sort of calmed down after the murder, maybe they had felt guilty and couldn't bear to look at what they had done, and so they covered her up.
I know, but just covering her face, the body's still there with stab wounds in it, there's blood all over the floor. I mean, Jesus Christ, throwing his pillow over her face, not going to do anything, is it?
Finch, this basically felt like a substance-fueled crime of passion. However, when he stepped into the bedroom, the scene inside of there told a totally different story. On the bed was Tibor Vass, the second victim, and he was completely naked, and he had been very carefully posed in this strange position where he was on his back and his knees were bent. It was immediately obvious to Finch that Tibor had not been killed here on this bed.
Right.
There was only a tiny bit of blood on the sheets, and Tibor's body itself was perfectly clean, like it had been washed, you know, before being arranged on the mattress. And then when Finch walked over to get a better look at Tibor's body, he saw that the man's injuries were much neater than Alice's. Tibor only had 2 stab wounds, at least that Finch could see, and both of them were directly to his heart. So this was a very efficient murder. And so after a minute or two, Finch sort of backed up and just, you know, found himself feeling really confused, because even though he was in one crime scene, you know, there are 2 victims, 1 crime, it almost felt like it was 2 totally different crimes.
Maybe Tibor was asleep and he stabbed them quick, whereas Alice would have been maybe awake and was trying to fight back, which is why it might explain why she got multiple stab wounds.
Like the murder that took place out there with Alice had been messy and very impulsive seeming, and possibly was because the murderer was, you know, heavily intoxicated.
Possibly.
And then
Or
this
drugged.
murder of Tibor, it seemed like it was committed by somebody who was much more methodical and potentially even sober. And so Finch couldn't help but wonder, like, how does this missing roommate, Attila Ban, fit into this picture? Because clearly, like, that's the piece that seems to be missing and likely would sort of answer all of his questions. And so at this point, what Finch decided he would do is he would go track down the other hotel workers who had been at this party the night before, you know, to see if they knew where Attila was or what happened to Attila or why any of this happened. You know, they were there. Maybe they knew something. And so Finch, he turned around and left the bedroom, and he very carefully navigated back across the living room, being careful not to step in any blood. And then he left the apartment. And as he did, he sort of noticed something strange. But right now he knew the most important thing was going and speaking to those other workers to see what they knew. And so for now, he sort of forgot this strange element he thinks he's discovered, put it over here, and just said, I'll deal with that later. And off he went to go find the other workers. Over the next few hours, Finch spoke to a whole bunch of hotel workers, and they were able to tell him a lot about Alice, Tibor, and Attila. Basically, they were all good friends, they all worked together, and they were known for being very responsible and very hardworking. Alice apparently had only just begun working at the hotel a few weeks ago, and coworkers said that she and Tibor seemed to have some chemistry, but no one was sure whether their relationship went beyond a platonic friendship, because Alice actually did have a boyfriend. And Tibor's roommate, Attila, the one who was missing, was apparently—
Could be a boyfriend then, couldn't it? Maybe she was getting friendly with either Attila or Tibor.
a hotel manager, and recently he'd been named Employee of the Year, and everybody seemed to really love working with him. Finch also learned more about the party that Tibor and Attila had hosted in their apartment the night before, during which the murders, must have happened. And apparently, it was really just a small gathering to celebrate Tibor getting into college, and the only people in attendance were Tibor, Attila, Alice, and then 2 other coworkers. Finch had interviewed those 2 other coworkers, and they would say that, during this party, this gathering, everybody had been drinking really heavily. But they insisted that it was a calm night without any conflicts or fights. And they both said that when they left the party, Alice and Tibor and Attila were all alive, awake, and totally fine. And so this information certainly seemed to suggest that Attila did it. I mean, he was the most obvious one that could have committed these murders. The 3 were left alone, 2 wind up dead.
But then that's too obvious now, isn't it? Because now he's just said it, well, I said it.
This one that could have committed
Maybe
these
it's
murders.
Carl
The 3 were left
from the other
alone,
video.
2 wind up dead, the 3rd is missing, Attila. But Attila, despite the fact he was missing, which did sort of make him very suspicious, beyond that, he was like this unbelievably sweet guy who had no problems with anyone. He was like the Employee of the Year. Like, it just didn't track. Nobody thought Attila could have done this. Nobody. The fact that Alice had a boyfriend, but apparently was, getting close to Tibor and, sort of going beyond being just platonic.
There you go.
That was intriguing to Finch. Coworkers said Alice, flirted with Tibor a lot. And Finch thought it was definitely possible that maybe the boyfriend had come to the apartment and found Alice and Tibor together being sort of inappropriate and killed them out of jealousy. It felt like a very possible—
Killing them like that, though, is a bit extreme, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? To kill someone because they cheated on you. I mean, it's bad getting cheated on and stuff, but, what makes your brain go to a place where I have to make them dead?
theory. However, that would explain why Alice's body was in the state it was in, but that theory would not explain why Tibor's body had been posed in such a bizarre way, or also what happened to Attila. Like, where's Attila? Now, Finch knew that all day his team had been pulling surveillance video from around the hotel. So in the evening, around 7 p.m., he went back to the station to start combing through the footage. He wanted to get his eyes on every single person who entered and left the employee housing area on the night of the killings.
Right.
The hotel really was covered in cameras, and odds were the killer would be somewhere on those tapes. But later that night, when Finch finally got to the end of all the footage he was given, he was baffled. So the surveillance video didn't actually show the doorway to Tibor and Attila's apartment. It just showed the area around the building that contained the apartment. So Finch could only see who entered and left the building, not the individual apartment. So that was a limitation, but he could see Tibor and Attila and Alice and those other 2 party guests enter the building before the party, and he could see those same 2 party guests leave hours later.
Maybe
at
they
almost
did
the
it.
exact time they had told him
And they're lying.
There was no sign of Alice's boyfriend at all, which meant he very likely was not the killer. Otherwise, you'd see him somewhere on this tape and he just was not there. And so as disappointing as that was, it, made sense and it at least sort of progressed the case. But Finch is also thinking, like, the thing the footage also doesn't show is what happened to Attila. Where is Attila? On the morning of August 12th, so 2 days after the bodies were found, Detective Finch went back to the apartment, now with his team of detectives. Attila, at this point, was still missing. Nobody knew what happened to him. And that was actually why Finch was back here with his team. He wanted to take a second look around, not just the building and the apartment, but really the whole area. Because they had traced Attila's phone and it was pinging off a cell tower right next to the hotel, as if he was like still here. But, keep in mind, by this point, police have searched the whole grounds, including every room, all the closets, all the utility areas. They've looked everywhere on this property and they have not found a trace of him. But Finch thinks, like, what else can I do but just keep on looking? So now, Finch and his team greeted the officer who was still standing guard by the crime scene door, and the officer let Finch and the other investigators in. And pretty much the second Finch stepped back inside this apartment now for the second time, he knew something was off. Finch had been staring at crime scene photos for the past 2 days obsessively, and as a result, he really had a good feel for how this place had been left. Because remember, when they take photos and when they, dust for prints and all that, they try to leave the scene exactly the way it is because it's all evidence until, the case is solved. But as soon as he walked in, he saw there was a vodka bottle that clearly had been moved. And his first thought is like, are you kidding me? Like, is this us? Are one of our techs moving stuff and not putting it back? Like, are we tampering with our own evidence?
No, because Attila's never left the building.
Has somebody somehow broken in here and like moved things around, without our own guards knowing about it? Like, what's going on here? And at the same time, Finch is faced with this new reality here. One of the other investigators pointed to the bedroom door, which was closed. And he said that he'd been here when the forensics team had left, and he was positive they had left that door open. And so Finch is like totally flabbergasted. He walks over to the door and he turns the doorknob and tries to open it, but clearly there is something blocking the door, like somebody put something on the other side of the door to keep it from opening up all the way. And so at this point, Finch and the other guys began basically ramming on this door until finally they were able to push it open just enough that they could look inside. And when they did, they find the missing third person, Attila Ban. He's lying face down on the bed, he was naked, and he was covered in blood.
So he was
it would
killed
turn
as
out
well.
the murders did take place during that party. The killer was there with Alice, Tibor, and Attila.
The 2 guests.
Killer, at some point during this party, after those other 2 guests had left, they saw Alice and Tibor kissing, and it drove them mad.
The boyfriend.
With jealousy. And they grabbed a knife, and for a short period, they went into an absolute frenzy, repeatedly stabbing Alice brutally until she was dead, and then turning their attention and stabbing Tibor twice in the heart.
Wow.
And so they had brutally killed these 2
For
in
kissing.
a total fit of rage. But the killer knew there were some loose ends inside of this apartment. And so very carefully, they slinked their way into the bedroom, and with that same knife they had just used to kill those 2, they cut open the side of the mattress, and they crawled inside, and they waited. When Detective Finch first left the apartment, like that first time he was there, and he's leaving to go speak to the hotel workers, when he opened the apartment door and he began to leave, he stopped because he noticed something weird. He didn't pursue it right then and there because he wanted to prioritize the interviews, but what he noticed was there's so much blood inside of this apartment. It's everywhere. Like the techs are telling me to be careful where I step so I don't track blood around.
Right.
But he's looking down, like he's just opened the door to the apartment, and there's no blood leaving the apartment. All the blood is contained inside of the apartment. How is that possible? Well, the reason it was possible is because the killer never left the apartment. And so fast forward 2 days to August 12th, the same day that Detective Finch and his team came back to the apartment to do another sweep. So earlier that same day, the killer is still inside the mattress, but they know now they have to deal with Attila. And so very carefully, the killer slides out of the mattress they've masterfully been hiding in for the past 2 days undetected.
Wow.
And for reasons not fully understood, they ended up moving some things in the apartment, like that vodka bottle that was moved.
Right.
And then also they went back inside the bedroom with Attila, and they barricaded the door shut with something heavy. So they're barricaded inside the very room they've been hiding in, and now it's time to deal with Attila. And so the killer gets on the mattress, and they take their own clothes off, and they cut their wrists.
Attila?
As it turns out, the killer
was Attila.
Attila
the killer. So he was right.
The same person. And Attila was madly in love with his roommate, Tibor. And at that party, when he saw Tibor kissing Alice, he knew that his love was unrequited. And it threw him into a rage, and he stabbed and killed both of them. And then he sort of arranged Tibor his love in this sort of strange position, which probably was because he had such strong feelings for him. And then also when he attempted to take his own life 2 days later, when he staged his own death on the bed there, he sort of arranged himself in the same pose. But again, he didn't die. And so after Finch and his detectives broke into the room, they found Attila. They were able to get him to a hospital and treat him. And then once he was stable, he was arrested, found guilty of the murders, and sentenced to 26 years in prison.
Damn. What an absolute knob. Well, we're all there. Mr. Ballen led down the garden path in that last story thinking he was going to be jealous of the girl and he was after the lad. No way. Jesus Christ, some crazy stories. That first one with that chopping the bodies and putting in the suitcase, that was rough, that. I mean, how someone thinks they're going to get away with the perfect murder when the murder was anything but perfect is beyond me. What goes through these people's minds to make them think that what they're doing is going to be inconspicuous? Yeah, Mr. Ballen, man. He's such a good storyteller. He's so good at telling these stories. He keeps you encapsulated. He gets them twist absolutely perfect every single time, and you know, leaves us feeling shocked every single time as well. And I just can't believe there's people like this in the world. To be honest, it's crazy. Absolute madness. Anyway, what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to check out the original video, and I'll see you next time.